Some families inherit land. Others inherit stories. Mine inherited a secret. A quiet one. A secret my grandfather carried alone through 6 long decades. And one the forest never forgot. I used to think his tale was only something he told to keep our imaginations alive during those cold Washington winters. Something warm to place beside a dying fire. But secrets like his do not stay buried forever. Some return the moment the earth itself begins to shift. I grew up on a small piece of family property tucked between cedar stands and moss-covered trails. My grandfather lived in the old house down the ridge, a place that always smelled of pipe smoke and pine tar. He was a patient man, quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel safe even if you never understood why. He told the story many times over the years. Sometimes while sitting on the porch watching the fog roll down the mountain. Sometimes while sharpening tools in the barn. Sometimes after a glass of whiskey when the night turned too still to pretend nothing lived in those woods. In 1962, during one of the worst snowstorms the valley had seen, he went hunting with 2 of his brothers. They were deep in the mountains when the storm changed direction and swallowed them whole. His brothers made it back. He did not. Not at first. He told us he wandered for hours with frozen hands and a dying lantern. Snow drifts swallowing his boots. Wind sharp enough to tear at skin. He said he had reached the point where cold no longer hurt. Only numbed. Only quieted. He said he fell somewhere near a gorge he could never locate again. The next thing he remembered was waking inside a crude shelter built of branches and stones. There was heat from a fire that should not have existed. And sitting across from him was a massive figure he could barely describe. He said the creature spoke no human language, but its presence was steady, watching him, keeping him alive. He swore its hands wrapped around his arms and hauled him out of the snow as easily as lifting a child. He swore it sat with him until the storm ended and led him back toward the lower trails. Then it vanished into the trees, leaving only enormous footprints he never managed to follow. The family dismissed the story for years, called it a hallucination from frostbite or whiskey or exhaustion. But I remember being a boy, sitting cross-legged beside him, listening to the way his voice softened when he spoke about the creature. Not with fear, not with shame, with something close to reverence. He made a plaster cast of one of the prints. He kept it wrapped in canvas beneath his bed like an artifact meant to stay hidden. When I was 12, he let me hold it. It was wide enough to cover both my hands. Heavy, deep, unlike anything a man could fake. Time moved on. My grandfather grew old. His hands shook. His memories faded. But every year, on the anniversary of the rescue, he walked to the family cemetery behind the property and left an offering of cedar branches on the snow. He said it was for the one who saved him. A thank you to someone the world refused to believe in. He passed away last spring. Peacefully, quietly, like a candle burning down to its last warm ember. Last week, on the morning we visited his grave to place winter flowers, something happened that pulled me backward into his story and set my world on a path I still cannot turn away from. The ground was covered in fresh snow, untouched, pure as a blank page. My boots left clean prints as I approached the small headstone. My breath floated white in the cold air. And then my cousin stopped walking. She pointed at the snow near the grave. I thought she was joking. I thought she had seen an animal track or the shape of a fallen branch. But no. There, pressed into the snow, were footprints. Enormous. Perfect. Bare. Toes splayed wide. The stride long enough to make my chest tighten. Footprints that led from the treeline straight to the grave. Footprints that circled it once. Slowly. Thoughtfully. And then walked back into the woods without disturbing a single branch. I knelt beside one of the prints. My fingers hovered over it, trembling. It was cold. Too cold. Crisp around the edges as if it had been made moments before we arrived. The depth was impossible for any man to replicate. My breath fogged as I leaned closer, and for the first time in my life I felt a sensation that did not belong to fear or wonder. Recognition. These prints matched the plaster cast my grandfather had guarded all his life. I drove home and dug the cast out from the old wooden chest where my grandmother kept his belongings. I placed it beside a photo of the grave we had taken on my phone. The match was perfect. Identical shape, identical width, identical weight in the snow. I remember sitting at the kitchen table long after the sun went down, the cast in my hands, my heartbeat slow and heavy. Outside the window the forest stretched into darkness, silent and watchful. For the first time in 60 years, something had returned to the place where my grandfather slept beneath the earth. Maybe it came to mourn him, maybe to honor him, maybe to check if he had truly passed from this world. I do not know, but I do know this. A creature does not walk 5 miles through snow to stand beside a grave unless something in its memory guides it. Something deep, something ancient, and whatever guided it brought it straight to him. That night I lay awake for hours, listening, waiting. The wind moved through the trees like a slow sigh. At dawn, before the morning frost had even lifted, I made a decision I had been avoiding for years. I would retrace my grandfather's footsteps on the mountain trail. I would walk the route he followed in 1962, storm or no storm. I would go back to the gorge he swore he nearly died in. And I would see with my own eyes if the creature from his story was still out there. Watching, remembering, returning. I packed only what I needed. A notebook, his old compass, and the plaster footprint wrapped in a cloth the same way he had wrapped it for 60 years. I am heading to the mountain he nearly died on. And something tells me I am not going alone. The trail my grandfather walked in 62 begins behind the old barn, where the cedar trees grow close enough together to hide the rising slope. I remembered following him partway when I was a boy. The smell of wet moss, the crunch of twigs under his boots, his hand on my shoulder as he pointed at distant ridges and said they were older than anything humans ever built. I used to think he was talking about the mountain. Now I am not so sure. I started up the trail just after sunrise, when mist still clung to the undergrowth and turned the forest into a white breathing world. My boots left clean tracks in the frost. The trees around me stood silent, watching. The higher I climbed, the more I sensed the weight of something unseen pressing between the branches. Not threatening, not welcoming either, just present. As if the woods themselves waited for me to make a choice I did not yet understand. I carried my grandfather's old journal in my pack. The leather was stiff, cracked at the spine. He wrote sparingly, but every page mattered. He had sketched landmarks that barely existed anymore. A fallen spruce trunk he described as a bridge, now rotted into soil. A boulder shaped like a broken tooth. A clearing he called the listening place, where he claimed the forest fell silent for no reason at all. By mid-morning I reached that clearing. The moment my boots touched the center of it, the wind stopped. Even the birds quieted. The silence was complete and sudden, like someone had pressed their palm over the mouth of the entire forest. I stood there, breathing softly, waiting for something to move. Then a knock echoed from deep within the trees. 2 knocks, slow, heavy, as if something large struck a hollow trunk far away. My breath tightened. Knocking is a sound people in this valley whisper about but never speak openly. It is a sign of something watching you, something curious, something that does not want to be seen directly. I took a step toward the sound, but before I reached the edge of the clearing, a second knock came from behind me, farther away. Then another knock from the ridge above. They were spaced apart by distance, not by echo. They were answering one another, communicating, just like my grandfather wrote. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No branches shook. No snow drifted from the canopy. But I knew I was no longer alone on that trail. I continued deeper into the mountains. The markers in the journal became harder to follow. The forest had grown thicker over the decades, hiding paths that once were clear. Still, the land remembered the shape of his route. I recognized the angle of the slope, the bend in the ridge, the narrow canyon where a stream once ran. My boots crunched over frozen leaves, their scent rising faintly like old memories released back into the air. It was early afternoon when I found the abandoned logging cabin. I knew it from his description the moment I saw it. Leaning sideways, half swallowed by roots. The roof sagged under years of snowfall. The door hung crooked, scraping the floor as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The walls were scratched by claws or tools or time. Sunlight slanted through a broken window, catching dust that drifted slowly like ash. In the corner I found the carvings my grandfather mentioned. Simple lines etched into the wood. His initials, the date, the mark of a man trying to cling to the world while losing his grip on life. But beside those marks were new ones, deeper, taller, higher than any human arm could reach. 3 long grooves cut clean into the timbers, not like bare scratches, too parallel, too deliberate, as if a massive hand had tested the strength of the wall, leaving only the faintest hint of intention. The wood around the grooves was fresh, not rotted, not weathered. Whatever made them had done so recently. My heart thudded hard in my chest. I backed away slowly, feeling the cabin press colder around me. Outside, the forest remained utterly still. No wind, no birds, no insects, only the brittle whisper of my breath. Then something moved behind the cabin. A heavy step, soft but unmistakable, followed by another. The hair on my neck rose. I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering. There, beyond the broken window, in the shadow between 2 massive cedars, a figure stood. Not fully seen, not fully hidden. Something large, tall, shoulders wide enough to blot out the morning light. Its outline shifted like the dark windless shape of a tree trunk. But I knew better. It was watching me, watching the cabin, watching the marks on the wall. I did not move. I barely breathed. A deep calm washed over me, the kind you feel in the presence of something that will not harm you unless it chooses to. The figure remained still for a long moment. Then the forest around me hummed with a low vibration, almost like a sound too deep for human ears. A sound that filled the valley the same way a heartbeat fills a chest. The figure stepped back, melting into the shadows between the trees without breaking a single branch or disturbing a single drift of snow. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I walked outside, trembling. My boots cracked the ice on the ground, leaving tracks behind me. I followed the line where I thought the figure had been. There were no footprints, not even one. The untouched snow glittered beneath the weak sunlight, perfect and smooth as a frozen lake. A place where nothing living had walked in hours. But I had seen something, and it had seen me. I continued up the mountain, my mind spinning with the revelation. The forest seemed to subtly shift as I walked, as if the trees leaned to let me pass or stood straighter to watch me go. The trail ended at the edge of a ridge overlooking the valley where my grandfather nearly died. The wind sighed across the gorge, carrying with it a faint scent of cedar smoke. The same scent he always smelled when he told the story of that night. Then I saw something resting on a flat stone near the cliff edge. A small cedar branch, fresh, green, laid carefully, deliberately, just like the offerings my grandfather left at the grave every year. My breath caught. The world fell silent again. The creature knew who I was, and it wanted me to continue. There are truths that settle slowly, like rainwater sinking into old soil. Others strike the mind all at once, leaving a scar that never fully fades. What happened after I followed my grandfather's trail up that mountain belongs to both. A truth I felt long before I accepted it, and one I have carried quietly ever since. I did not reach the end of his path alone. By the time I stood at the ridge overlooking the valley, the forest no longer felt empty. The cedar branch placed on the stone was not an accident. It was a sign, a message. I knew that the moment I saw it. I picked it up and held it gently. It smelled fresh, almost warm, as if someone had placed it there only seconds earlier. But the snow around it was untouched. Not a single print, not a bent blade of grass, not even the faintest disturbance. Only the mark of the branch itself resting lightly on the stone. As I stood there, holding that small offering, the memory of my grandfather's voice rose in the quiet air. He used to say the forest knew him, that something lived within those trees that watched over him, not like a guardian but like an old neighbor, someone who knew grief, someone who understood loneliness, someone ancient enough to remember the world before men carved their names into it. He never said the word Sasquatch to me when I was young. He only said the watcher, the quiet friend, the tall man of the trees. I thought he was telling stories to pass the time. But now, standing in the same place where he had nearly died 60 years ago, I realized he had avoided the word because it was too small, too simple, too human. Whatever he encountered that night in 1962 was more than a creature. It was something with intention, something that chose him. I knelt by the edge of the ridge and opened my grandfather's journal, letting the cold wind turn the pages. Near the back, I found a final entry he never read aloud. A shaky line written near the end of his life, as if he wanted to confess something but never found the courage to share it. Said, "He saved me once, and he will return when the trees fall quiet." I closed the journal slowly. The forest around me was silent now, completely, as if waiting for me to understand exactly what had begun. I climbed down from the ridge at dusk. The woods glowed faintly as the moon rose through the fog. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every breath of wind carried a memory of that heavy silence I had heard as a child when my grandfather spoke of the mountains. By the time I reached the cabin again, I felt watched, but not hunted, not threatened, just observed. I stayed in the cabin that night. I built a fire the way my grandfather taught me. The flames flickered softly, casting warm light against the old cedar walls. For a long time I sat there, staring at the journal, wondering what he had truly seen and why he had carried that secret until the day he died. Then I heard it. A single knock on the tree outside. Slow, firm, heavy. Not a warning, a greeting. I rose and stepped to the window, heart pounding. The clearing outside the cabin was a pool of silver moonlight. Snow stretched smooth across the ground, untouched. The trees swayed gently, the branches whispering against one another. At first I thought the knock had been my imagination, a memory carried by the wind. But then something shifted at the edge of the clearing. A tall figure stood near the treeline, half shadow, half moonlight, shoulders impossibly broad, hair glinting silver at the ends, a shape both familiar and unreal. I stood frozen, breath caught in my throat. He stood perfectly still, watching the cabin, watching me. For a moment I believed he would step forward, that he would approach like he did in my grandfather's story. Sit by the fire, speak without words, show me why he had saved the old man that winter so long ago. But instead he bowed his head, just once, slow, respectful, final. Then he turned and disappeared into the woods without disturbing a single flake of snow. The next morning, I returned to my grandfather's grave. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around the headstones. And there, pressed into the earth beside the grave, were the footprints. Not fresh this time, but not old either. Deep impressions. White, human in shape, but far too large, too heavy, too deliberate. They faced the grave with quiet stillness, as if the creature had knelt there for hours. Maybe all night, maybe longer. I touched the cold earth and felt a sting of something more than grief. A sense of understanding settling into my chest. My grandfather had always told the truth. He had carried a secret that was not meant to be believed. And the Watcher of the Woods had honored him long after the world forgot his name. In the years that followed, I returned to the mountains often. Not to hunt, not to prove anything, but to listen. Sometimes I heard distant knocks. Sometimes a low call that echoed between the ridges. Sometimes the soft crunch of something moving through the trees with care far greater than any animal. But I never saw the creature again. I do not think he wanted to be seen by me twice. Now, years later, I record this confession knowing no one will accept it. But the truth is no longer mine to hide. It belongs to the same forest that kept my grandfather alive in 1962, and to the creature who still walks those trails during misty dawns. My grandfather did not imagine his rescuer. He remembered him, and last week, when I found those footprints at his grave, I understood their meaning. He did not come to frighten us. He came to say goodbye. And somewhere deep within those cedar-covered mountains, where memory and myth walk the same path, I know the Watcher still keeps his silent vigil. He kept his promise. And now the secret is mine to carry.